crazy. Okay, so hello everyone. We're just trying to figure out some technical difficulties, and one of them is that one of our panelists has not been able to get into the room. But we have informed program ops, and hopefully they will be. Jamar, hello. You're muted. There you go.
Hello.
Hello. Welcome.
Thank you. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Nice to meet you all.
Very pleased we have you here.
Yes. Yes.
Well, thank you.
So our subject is graphic novels, and I'm the one who changed it into graphic novel adaptation. I know in your bio, Jamar, you had talked about adapting something into the graphic form.
Yes.
And Valerie has an interest in the Buffyverse, which has been adapted to graphic forms, and I had some things to bring up. So I thought, hey, this could make a panel, and hopefully we'll have a great conversation. I want to start out by asking you guys to introduce yourselves. I habitually just do this in alphabetical order. So Jamar, could you tell us about yourself, maybe give your pronouns and a little bit of your background?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. My name is Jamar Nicholas, Philadelphia-based artist, cartoonist, and educator. I have he, him pronouns. I'm known primarily for doing webcomic, comic, and graphic novel work. One of my biggest accomplishments in the past 10 years was adapting and illustrating Jeffrey Canada's Fist, Stick, Knife, Gun, which you just happened to see right back there. How'd that happen? Look at that. Also, I have started to delve into kid lit. I've been doing middle grade graphic novels. I have a creator-owned series called Leon, Protector of the Playground.
Right, I've seen that.
Oh, cool. Which came out a couple of years ago. It's won some awards, and I also received the Dwayne McDuffie Award for Diversity in 2018 for Leon. So,
very cool.
Thank you. Very happy.
I subscribe to Leon Low Books, which has a great blog about diverse books and including for children. So, but I don't think that's actually where I saw that. I think I saw that at the library. Our library does a good job of acquiring things, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is awesome.
Sure.
So Valerie, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, Valerie Estelle Frankel, she, her. I write academic books about pop culture, so I've got, and I keep forgetting to mention, I'm Silicon Valley Authors in the dealer's room. Yes, we have one. Anyway, I am the author of about 80 books of analysis on Star Wars, Doctor Who, Game of Thrones, Buffy, Xena, and what do you know? All of those have some kind of graphic novel adaptation, spin-off, rewrite, sequel, something we could talk about. And I also have several books on superheroines that I was analyzing across mediums. I was saying, how are superheroines depicted here? And I'm willing to look at novels, short stories, comics, TV, movies. So I definitely was seeing some differences as I was cross-comparing sometimes the same character across all of these.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting point. Like, you know, there's different ways that things have been adapted. They can either be adapted really true to the original, like basically the same script, but just presented in a different format. And then they can also be adapted with a new interpretation of the story or the characters. Which was it that the approach that you took with Fist, Stick, Knife, Gun, Jamar?
Well, that's a great question. And I would say my answer to that was, it was pretty much more of a straightforward approach of me taking Jeff's original memoir and kind of shaving it down to create a graphic narrative.
Right.
Jeff's storytelling, and just to give a little background, Jeff Canada is, well, he is the president. He used to be like more on hand, the CEO of the Harlem Children's Zone in New York, which is responsible for kid colleges and basically transforming Harlem from the inside, making sure that every kid that goes through the doors goes to college.
Awesome.
But he had a very gripping tale of growing up in the South Bronx in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And it was a really popular book that came out from Beacon Press maybe 25 years ago now. And they asked me to adapt that. His writing at the time was very, like, I don't want to say all over the road, but he talked about his childhood growing up. Then he would switch it to the present, where he would talk about like a young man he met at the rec center who maybe didn't make it in the long run. And then he goes into it. So I had to kind of figure out a way to, unfortunately, like shave out things that didn't specifically happen to him. So I took this 25 chapter book and condensed it down into a strong 11, I think. So it's kind of like you're modifying something that really doesn't need to be modified, but just for the sake of storytelling and the vessel I'm trying to put it in, it was important.
That's interesting because I was just at a fascinating panel on memoir comics. And one thing they get to add is the artistry. I can show trauma through symbolism. I can use the art to push us this way and that way. The panel was at Comic-Con, so it's still available, and I'll post it for everyone. They were doing Holocaust memoir comics. And again, you saw a lot of artistry, and also the issue of these were often the children of, these weren't people who went through the experience writing the story. This was their child, their friend, somebody like that. So you had a little distance and presumably a little more room to do cool art with that. And Art Spiegelman's Mouse, where he made everybody into animal characters to tell the story, is another famous one.
Yeah. Have you seen Scott Westerfeld did a series after something happens, an entire series or an entire city is sort of taken over by an interdimensional or not really a portal, but like an overlapping of kind of a more supernatural dimension and reality. And there's a young woman who goes in to take pictures of the city, even though the city's like radioactive and everybody's afraid of it. And so the whole thing is just really super visual and fascinating. So I'm going to throw a few things in the group chat. I know that, I don't know if you guys know this, but we have a chat wrangler, and the chat wrangler's job is to bring questions from the audience to us. I'm going to pass one of those forward in just a second. But I also wanted to mention to you guys that if you have things that you want to share with the folks in the Discord, you can paste those into the chat and our chat wrangler will share them in the other direction. So we have a question from Bob Devney. He asks, do graphic novels have the same like length constraints as movies? Or is it like a movie script that can only contain as much text as like a long short story?
I would say no. I think that's one of the great powers of visual narrative. There's really no, it's got to be 144 pages. It could be as long as it needs to be, which I find very fascinating. I'm sure you've read graphic novels that were really, really thin, where you may start asking yourself, well, does this qualify to be a graphic novel? Like, where's the line? This feels like a pamphlet, right? Or then, big like phone book style.
Right. Oh yeah. Yeah. Like Finder or Blankets.
Yeah. And Blankets is a great example. So you take something like Craig Thompson's Blankets, and then something, like Persepolis, for all that is not a giant book. But, it still tells a really powerful story. So I would say that it's really up to the interpretation of the art team or creative or whoever's creating this thing.
Yeah, I think that's something similar as far as web comics. it sort of took a while for people to really start to play with the medium. But as people who had been stuck with newspaper specifications started to realize, oh, well, this doesn't have to be a 3-panel thing that goes like this, or a Sunday panel thing that goes like this. If I wanted to tell this whole story on a single page, I can just do that, and it's a long page where people scroll. And then now there's webtoons, and so like I substitute in the high school, and these kids, like, that's what they think of, right. Which is situations where they're having graphically told stories that have affiliated songs and soundtracks. So as soon as you open the story, you know, if you have the music on, and then at that point the artists are like, if you are reading this without the music, you're doing it wrong.
Sound one, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
That brings to mind, and I forget how long ago it was. It was a while. If you're familiar with Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics series, or 3 books, Understanding, Reinventing, and Making. When Reinventing came out, it may have been 2000 or something like that.
I haven't seen that one.
Yeah, it was in between. Like Understanding was the seminal tome, and then the second was Reinventing, where Scott McCloud spent the book examining the web and the new landscape of the internet and how that affects comic book making. So he talked about a term called the infinite canvas. So now you had experimental web cartoonists like Drew Wing and other people who, because you're not bound to a panel that fits on a screen. What if you could just scroll to the right?
Yeah.
Forever. Then how does the story change? And that kind of went its course, and people kind of forgot about that when we hit Web 2.0 or however we, absorb information. But when Webtoons showed up, all of a sudden, the infinite canvas came back. But now you're scrolling on the screen like this. So sure, McCloud didn't interpret that's where this would end or show up. But it's really interesting to connect those two things.
Yeah, and then you have, sorry, this is a little off topic, but basically, if you've ever read the XKCD, he did an experiment one time where he created a huge landscape that, of course, you see it through just a panel, but it was interactive. So as the reader, you could move through it. So it was like being in a video game, but there were little narrative bits that occurred, or you'd be like going up the landscape of a mountain, and then suddenly there'd be a person sitting there in a cave, like doing something. And if you got to certain points, something would happen. And the whole, that was an interesting thing too. I think people expected us to go further in by now, as far as making it possible for authors to create interactive narratives. And at this point, as far as the gaming industry, we're still doing projects that basically have pretty substantial teams of talent to put out something like that. Yeah. There was a teacher at Carnegie Mellon, Randy Pausch, who mainly taught robotics and programming, but one of the things that he wanted to do was get more girls involved in programming. And so they were like, well, why don't girls get involved in programming? And I was like, well, most of the programming assignments we have for them to do are mostly like, make this thing pick up that thing. They're basically like construction tasks. And for whatever reason, girls didn't tend to get into that sort of task as much, or sensor tasks or something, but as much as boys. And then they're like, well, what do girls like to do? And it was like, well, at these ages, girls really like to tell stories when they play imaginative games and tell stories. And so he created a platform called Alice that facilitated creating a 3D environment and telling a story in it. And unfortunately, Randy died a few years ago. If you ever get a chance to look up his last lecture, Google like Randy and last lecture, and you'll get it. He knew he was dying, and it's about his sort of quest to fulfill all of his childhood dreams before he passed on. He was just a fascinating person. Anyway, I can babble. Valerie, did you have some thoughts after all this? Or do you want to segue to a new topic?
New topic, I think.
Okay, let's do that. You were talking about some superheroine analysis across different media. Yeah. What would you say as far as, like, are there patterns in how they are treated in those different media?
Oh, yes. I mean, comic books, it depends on the era, but so many superheroine comics, like, say, Witchblade, are all about how cleverly we can cover and uncover bits of the heroine's anatomy. So, in contrast with the TNT TV show Witchblade, which had her fully dressed and was trying to do a cop procedural with also some interesting spiritual stuff going on. Mm-hmm. So, it's not that you can't have a fully dressed comic, and people, you know, have had some wonderful ones lately, but sometimes the premise of the comic can be on what I could call the really sexist visuals. On the other hand, another way to do this is to have a comic that's focused on amazing, wonderful, artistic, gorgeous visuals. And in that case, if you move to TV, then you're probably telling a traditional TV show and have lost the, you know, painting quality. Greg Rucka's Batwoman Elegy, everybody read this thing and said, oh my God, they're being framed by music notes when they fall in love. And oh my gosh, the symbolism, the creativity, the way they put the panels together, this is amazing. And Batwoman, the TV show, is perfectly nice, but obviously they don't have like little music notes floating around them.
Yeah.
And likewise, shout out to Echo, who's Daredevil's girlfriend, so it's sometimes called Echo/Daredevil, by David Mack. She's a deaf superheroine, and the comic is a scrapbook. She's got self-portraits. She's got sign language. It's this amazing, amazing artistic endeavor. And I would assume if we saw her on Daredevil or something, I don't think we have, she would just show up in a tight outfit and karate chop people. So sometimes you lose a lot.
So that reminds me of the whole, like, the New 52 reimagination of Wonder Woman. It seemed like there was an active attempt to not just make her modern, but maybe make her a little bit more sturdy around the waist and not so skinny, a little bit more physically plausible, and maybe shift a little bit away from the whole bondage focus. What are your thoughts on how successful they were with that?
Yeah, the novel Warbringer is a Wonder Woman novel, just came out a year or two ago, and it was amazing and delightful and deep and entertaining. And Wonder Woman, of course, there have been really good comics, really bad comics, really strippery comics.
Right.
And then the movie. So there you've got 70 years to look at who's done it right and not.
Yeah. You were nodding, Jamar, you agree? Or?
Oh, well, you know, I think maybe coming from the illustrator side of it, and also dealing with fandom as a comic book creator.
Yeah.
There's always a pressure, and, you know, I don't want to get into too much, but there's always a pressure to keep a character relatable from a classic sense, right? As an example that I'm making up, say there's an artist who finally gets the call up to draw Wonder Woman, and he's like, okay, cool. I'm a Linda Carter television Wonder Woman fan, so I want her to look like this. Right. But there's a possibility that the people who actually read Wonder Woman comic books would not like that, you know, or you know what, I want to modernize her, but then there's always a pushback. So I think editorial and creative wants to make things first visually interesting, that might be one of the first bullet points. But also, I don't think anybody's in the practice of trying to get yelled at on Twitter for things. You know what I mean?
I think some people are, but
Yeah.
not creative.
Yeah, I think as a cartoonist, like most of us don't try to be provocative for no reason. You know, it's like I don't need that kind of static when I log on to Twitter.
Right.
But it happens a lot. So I think, you know, the push to make things more modern or more sensible from a 2020 standpoint, who would dress like this, who would fight in shoes like this, all those kind of things. Sometimes I think those conversations happen too late in the editorial process, you know, where it could be the book's like 3 weeks late and let's just get this done. And then, oh man, we talked about the sandals, but we forgot to take you know what I mean? So I think it was a little bit more at play in the background of these things. But, you know, I'm all for making, you know, things relatable and realistic.
Yeah, I think you see that also if you look at the more recent Star Wars comics. We have, if you look at the original movies, I mean, besides all the costuming things with Leia, there's so many trivias, like the fact that the director didn't want her to be too sexual when she was in that white outfit, so she actually had to bind her breasts so they wouldn't bounce. To like, you know, just things about the story, like for instance, in the story, the first film, A New Hope, we're very focused on Luke. We find out his backstory. We know what his youth was like and what his dreams are and what he's letting go of to join the rebellion. And then we meet Leia and it's just, well, she's a diplomat and she's sassy and she's strong and she's a leader, but we don't know anything really about her background at that point. We find out a little bit more, but that's just basically, you know, where the perspective is that's told from. And so then in one of the more recent comic series, we get the chance to see, well, how did she go from being a rebellious teenager to being, you know, the leader of the rebellion? And that's a really interesting, fun story. So
yeah, the latest prequel, there's a big series taking place like between episodes 4 and 5 where Darth Vader wants to track down this random Luke kid who, you know, beat him and what's up with that. And yes, we see stuff like people from Alderaan asking Leia, is she gonna lead them? And we get so much backstory, which is one of those awesome things you could do with comics. And obviously Star Wars, you know, the fandom was there and the fandom was waiting. So that's fun. Another Star Wars one is they adapted the Star Wars, the really original idea George Lucas had about Anakin Skywalker and Princess Leia falling in love and Princess Leia becoming the new queen of Alderaan. Like, again, draft 1 of the script is out. Graphic novel.
Wow.
That's neat. That's neat. Do you have any favorite Star Wars stories in comics, Jamar?
Unfortunately, I didn't read a lot of the comics. I was a big fan of the original 70s Al Williamson's Marvel Star Wars comics, but I couldn't, with a gun to my head, talk about any of them. They were beautifully illustrated. That's all I could give you on that topic.
Well, and of course, Star Wars was a universe in which, like, you know, started as books, became movies, and then there was that whole set of books, and then in the most recent movies, there of course been all that debate, which you also often see in the graphic novel world, where there were certain lines of stories that they were just like, okay, that happened in the books, but in this universe, that didn't happen.
Right.
So I was really disappointed because then we lose, for instance, Luke Skywalker's wife, whom he had converted from the dark side, and she was a red-headed assassin, and, you know, pretty pretty kick-ass. So I was like, what? I have her figurine. I have, you know, I had an 8-year-old daughter, and I was like, what? So yeah, that was a bummer. I also think that, you know, currently we're seeing in the Star Wars films and the prequels, especially, but even in the mainline, an expansion of diversity in the casting, which has been nice. And then of course we get to visit with those characters more in the comics. So like Star Wars Legacy, I always go the wrong direction here. There we go. You know, here we're in the new Jedi Order, and you know, the variation characters is not just with aliens. There's also a whole series about Poe Dameron, and who of course is I don't know what Poe's supposed to be actually, but character of color somehow.
Yeah, that'll work, right?
yeah. So, go ahead.
I found Poe's story not that exciting. I just read the novel where, he was a smuggler in his childhood because we dropped that in episode 9, so now we have to write a book about it. And I was just kind of yawning through it. As far as adaptation, the thing where they've created the Star Wars Disney park now means in every novel, someone has to eat Star Wars food and think about how yummy it is. They all like go to a bar and order the chicken nuggets and the blue milk and yum and the freakish popcorn. And I'm getting tired of that in the novel. So sometimes the adaptations go too far.
I didn't even think about that. I was reading Daniel Jose Older did a Star Wars novel recently. It's a Lando and
L3
Han story. What's it called? It's the last shot.
I meant it's Lando and L3, but yeah, it's Last Shot.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's Lando and L3 are partners, but it's Lando coming back to Han and being like, what did you get me into? And then Han being like, I think this is more complicated than that. Not my fault. But there is some talk of food in it, but more so, there's some really fun discussion about Lando's clothes. So that was one of my favorite parts of the book. Are you familiar with Daniel Jose Older's other work?
No, not really. But I'm excited to talk about capes if it goes that way.
Okay, I'll just mention that he's from New York, and he's Latino and Black, and he is an EMT. And he writes urban fantasy. Like one of his works is focused on, you know, ghosts in Central Park, which has mass African American graves underneath it, and so it's so rich, you know. Like, you take somebody whose career has had them regularly interacting with the dead and dying, and then they take that to the page. It's really interesting.
I'm going to put it on my list.
Okay, so what did you say you really wanted to talk about?
Well, no, I find the whole concept of world building really interesting, and I think that's something that fandom kind of craves, but not every creative thinks about it. You know, let's just assume. Here I go again with my assumptions. But let's just take the example of a comic artist who really enjoys just drawing like cool robots. Sometimes the idea of where the robot got this tank on the side of its arm doesn't really come up. But the fans have those questions, you know, kind of like, what's on Boba Fett's armor? What does this mean? What is it? What, you know, all of that kind of, I don't know, like searching for messages in a bottle type of thing that fandom wants. They want answers to things. And
now in The Mandalorian, we've had a chance to get into some of those types of questions,
which is super cool, you know. But, and I find that stuff interesting visually. I sometimes I don't, as somebody who absorbs other people's stuff. Sometimes I don't think so deeply about that because I know it's like, oh, well, it just looks cool isn't an answer anymore to a lot of people. Like everything has to have something behind it. So, I find that a very interesting topic to explore. Like, what does world building mean to everyone besides it just being there? It needs to have something sticky to it, right? Speaking
of something that is really deep, I think, as far as world building, we have a question from the audience. Bob Devney has suggested that Saga would be great to see in a movie or TV version. Do we think that would work? And what else would you like to see made into a movie or TV series, and why?
I'll let you go. And I'll
Are you familiar with Saga?
Yeah, I've been enjoying Saga. That's a good one. I've been enjoying, well, Lazarus could get really gross and violent. It's one of the ones where we can resurrect you and heal you, so we send you out to do all the dirty work, and it's a question of exploitation. So, brilliant comic. But again, the minute we have the power to resurrect and heal people, we get really gross and violent in some of these stories. The one I've been, banging on the wall going, give it already, is Marvel Rising is, well, long complicated thing. Lately, Marvel superheroes have had this amazing group of diverse, funny, lively, well-rounded girls who work together, who pop into each other's comics to go to Starbucks. To do all kinds of wonderful things. And we've got Squirrel Girl, we've got Kamala Khan's Ms. Marvel, we've got Ironheart, we've got Spider-Gwen, Shuri drops in sometimes, we've got some other ones, and they're just so delightful. And so as we sit there watching the big budget Marvel movies, and yes, everybody's done the math about how many they did before they did Black Panther and how many before Captain Marvel, and Wasp got half a movie and all that. Well, they made a Marvel Rising cartoon. It's on Disney Plus and YouTube. It's fun, it's delightful, it's sweet, it's charming, it's for a young audience. It teaches teamwork, Captain Marvel pops in, but a lot of us are going, way to not spend the millions on a really big budget thing. So, okay, there was my soapbox.
Let's see. I have to have an answer for this one. I'm looking at my bookshelf now.
Yeah, I guess there's certainly properties where we're like, we'd rather have, certainly rather have an animated version than no version at all.
I have a spicy answer. And
yeah.
I don't want to be spicy, but
oh, why not?
Well, just my cartoonist sensibility. I struggle with that question a lot. I really do. And people ask me questions like that all the time, kind of like when I'm at a comic book convention and somebody is standing in front of my exhibitor's table looking through my work, and they go, "Oh wow, this is really cool. When's the cartoon coming?" While they're holding my book.
Yeah.
Right. So to me, as a cartoonist, because that's what I am.
I'm listening. I'm going to be right back.
Yeah, sure. It's hard for me to go, oh, well, you know what would be a better version of the thing that I spent 20 years learning how to do? A movie. You know what I'm saying? So not to betray moving pictures and motion pictures and animation, because I went to school for animation. I totally love great cartoons. It's hard for me to answer a question like that when I feel like there's a big part of our culture that feels like movies or moving celluloid, or however you want to say it, is the ultimate form of entertainment, right? Whereas, I know a lot of school teachers and librarians and all of that who live for books, right? This is what it's about. To have printed matter in your hand is super important, and I'm not knocking anybody who loves movies too. I love movies, but there are some things that I would go, wow, yeah, that's cool. The thing that I read, they translated to the screen. That's interesting in a technical standpoint for me.
Yeah.
But a great example of that is when Spike Jonze made the Where the Wild Things Are movie.
Okay.
That
I haven't seen it.
the Maurice Sendak book,
Right.
which this came out maybe like 10 years ago.
Oh, it was like a live action thing, right?
Yeah. And I said to myself, did this need to be made?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So I kind of defend comic books in the same way.
It's like the live action version of Avatar, and you're like, or The Last Airbender, you know, and you're like, that creation was so awesome in and of itself. I went looking for Scott McCloud's version or book, Making Comics.
Oh, that's a great one. Yeah.
I think one of the things that he makes very clear is the type of perspective switching and the type of messaging that you can put in comics that you can't necessarily put in movies, or it's more challenging. You know, you can show things like characters' inner thoughts a lot more obviously, you know, and of course you can do that in written text, but in comics, you know, you have all this richness. I wanted to mention, I did find this when I went looking for the other one, and this, I mean, you could tell just from the cover, right? You have a depiction that now, okay, we could do it in movies because we've gotten really fancy, but it's still an effect that is just so effective in comics. And so, like, just to grab a really random example, again, you have he really talks a lot about choosing what you're going to represent in different panes and how you're going to represent it. And, you know, the way you get the emotions of these characters just from how open their eyes are, what, you know, like, or where they're looking, what they're looking at, and then how that leads you to be like, oh wait, what are they looking at? And carries the reader, the viewer, through this story. It really is, I mean, you know this, you're an artist, but it really is a very different narrative form.
Sure. Right. And the one last thing I'll say about that is I feel that movies and cartoons or things, you know, even if you're still somebody that actually collects physical objects, like, do you have DVDs on the shelf in your house? Books still have that life, that, you know, like an infinite lifespan, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, oh, I collected The Sculptor. It's a thick book that looks great. Boom, I put it right there on my shelf. But if you saw The Sculptor movie,
like we were talking about blankets, right?
Yeah.
This is a brick. This
right?
has heft. It has weight. It's beautiful.
It feels good in the hand. I just feel like the way that we are treating entertainment these days is that, you know, and even like our binge watching culture is like we consume things and then we wait for the next thing. So I think it takes away a little bit of the specialness of books, because, you know, you'll keep a book forever, but you saw a movie last night and you already forgot about it.
Mm-hmm.
So, like I said, I'm really about defending the sanctity of books and graphic literature.
Would you feel the same way, Valerie?
Sorry. What?
I'm sorry, did I derail the whole?
Oh no, just that was a really long.
She's like, there are a lot of things in there. What are you talking about?
Sorry.
You know, like when you look at a book like
that question.
Finder, you know, like that whole thing of, well, I'd really like to have something that I hold. I mean, I have to admit, like, I've had things that I've purchased because I'm interested in them off of Amazon that only existed in a Kindle version.
Right.
That I was like, oh, Nnedi Okorafor has a new comic out. Well, of course I want to buy it because she's awesome. And of course I want to read it because awesome. And then I buy it. And then years later, I happen to pick up my Kindle and I like go through and, oh, I've never
forgot.
You know.
Good point. The other side of it is Marvel.com, and yeah, that's different from the indie ones, but Marvel.com for $10 a month or whatever, you can have every Marvel comic they've ever done back to the invention of Marvel. And for my research, I've been sitting there going, I need Avengers 237, and having it right now would be convenient. So that's awesome. And my libraries have been getting subscriptions to every indie comic creator, basically everybody but Marvel and DC. They're going, yeah, we have a subscription to Boom Comics. Would you like those with your library card? Just click here. And so for the kids who can't afford this stuff and for the research, I've been reading 40 books a week.
Wow.
And libraries reopened recently post-COVID, so I've been diving into every library. So I'm just doing I would love to collect, but the books are already pushing me out of my room.
Yeah.
And again, I've got them coming and going so fast that I just go for, what do the libraries have? What can I get on the internet? What can I just click and grab?
Well, and that's a good point. I mean, our library has a huge electronic collection, and including subscriptions to services that provide access electronically. And of course, that does make those collections accessible to people who maybe can't get out of the house because there's like a virus or something. But you know, I do think it's interesting. Like my daughter, we all read comics, and she has read some comics. Like she sees me read my web comics, and she always wants to read them over my shoulder. And so finally I was just like, you know, I need you to not take over my computer for this. I'll take you to Go Comics on your computer, and you're allowed to read comics. And then she just like took off with it. She was like, oh, Rose is Rose, and you know, did that thing where she just binge read it for days. And which I think which I think was great. But you know, like generally speaking, when I point out something like, oh, well, you know, your school put a lot of things online for you guys if you want to read something, or the library has stuff online, you know, hey, you ran out of these Thea Stilton books, but there's more ebooks that you haven't read yet. I can't really get her to go for that right now. I mean, she's 10. Yeah.
Everybody's got their own medium. I'm just saying that I personally can't collect much more. The signed books are already pushing me out of my room. So
yeah, well, and these days, like I found, although I love meeting authors, that I'm mostly, if I have them sign something, I'm not having them personalize it anymore, so that I do have that freedom. If somebody walks in the door and I'm like, hey, this is awesome, you should read it, and just take it and give it to somebody else, I can just, you know, hand it to them and not feel like, oh, well, this was my personal memento, and they'll feel weird. Do you guys have any stories about favorite creators that you've met?
I do love J. Michael Straczynski and Peter David, and they've both done TV and comics, and they both are really good with like snappy dialogue and funny dialogue and punchlines and things that work well in both mediums.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, there are things that still work. Go ahead, Jamar.
I didn't really have an answer for that one.
Oh, well, what I was going to bring up was one of my favorite things that was adapted to comics is Firefly. And I tried to get Brian to grab one of our Firefly comics, but we're not quite sure where they are right now. But I don't know if you've read them. But to me, to my eye, and I'm like picky, like I love Strangers in Paradise and, you know, these other things that we've been talking about that are really visually luscious. And to my eye, the Firefly adaptations, and this is also true for a lot of the Buffy comics, they're just sort of churned out and feeling, you know, like it focuses more on just, well, this was the story that they told, so we have to tell the same story, or this is a new story and we're going to tell the story. But then, you know, so to me, like graphically, they aren't as rich as the original presentation. You don't have the grace of the actors. You don't have, you know, all that physicality from Buffy is really hard to show in graphic novel format. And, you know, you have that as well in Firefly. I mean, Zoe just had that je ne sais quoi, that you were just like, it's something about the way she carries herself and something about the way she talks, and I don't know, but it's kick-ass. And some of the artists have sort of captured that, but at the very least, they still have the snappy dialogue.
Yeah. I was just thinking back to the last question about adaptations to screen. I think Terry Moore's Strangers in Paradise would be interesting as a show.
It would.
That you brought it up. And I think I'd want to see it just from a point of interest. Like, I want to see how they're going to pull this off, because it's so character driven.
Are they doing it? Is it in progress?
I don't know if you think about that, but I was just thinking about my bookshelf and like, what would I like to see that would be different? Because there's nobody with claws for hands or kicking people through windows.
Right.
It's just relationships. You know, how would a quiet comic like Strangers in Paradise work on the screen as a TV show or something like that? So I just had that thought while you were talking about it.
Yeah. Well, and it's not so common these days, right? You think, oh, comics-based film, it's going to be rip-roaring or something.
Right. Not quiet. Right.
Not quiet. Yeah. It has a lot of spaces in it and beats. It's almost like I've tried to show my daughter things from the 70s and the 80s films.
Mm-hmm.
And there's so much empty space compared to what people are doing right now.
Yeah. I agree.
And it can be nice, like it can be effective. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But she gets bored and she's like, can I go do something else?
Right. Yeah. Everything is so kinetic now. Mm-hmm. So I think it's hard to do good character development or story development when you're not doing jump cuts every 5 seconds. And like, can you just keep the camera on somebody and let them act or emote? Or, let's have a chance to find out more about this person without somebody getting T-boned by a car. Like every time I see a show now and somebody's driving a car, I'm waiting for the sudden accident, because that's like, we've been trained for that now. But anyway.
No, I think that's true. Oh, I did want to mention one other type of adaptation. Valerie and I were talking about this before we got on, which was the adaptation of a well-known story, a nonfiction well-known story, into a graphic novel. Mm-hmm. So I mentioned I had tried to get Jim Ottaviani to join this panel. I don't know if you know his work, but he had T-minus is about the space race, and Primates is about 3 female primatologists, and he has, I don't know how many of them now, 10 or 12. Mm-hmm. And those have been really interesting to me. Valerie and I were talking about representation. Those bring, for instance, in Primates, the story of 3 female scientists to perhaps a younger, newer audience in a graphic presentation in a way I really appreciate. And then, of course, before we sadly lost him, the whole world went crazy over this, which is John Lewis's story of the March and Selma. So this came to mind earlier. I fetched it because when you were talking about things that are huge and heavy. I've already pulled up some very heavy things, but this is by far the heaviest. This is a 3-volume, everything's hardcover, boxed set. That I mean, it's gorgeous, and it's very well produced. It's
I'm sorry to interrupt. We're almost out of time.
So we're out of time. Yep.
Well, almost out of time. If we could wrap up in about the next minute or so, we do have to end the meeting at 2:50 p.m. Eastern. Thank you.
I can barely hear you, but we will wrap up. Any final thoughts?
Valerie, you want to go?
There's so much, and if you have a favorite series where you're kicking yourself that they took it away, do check if they decided to please the fans by making continuation comics, because I was surprised what they've made.
Good point. There's a lot. Jamar?
Read more comics.
Read more comics. Make sure everybody gets out on Free Comics Day and support your local comics shops because they're important.
That's right.
Yeah, they're very important. Thank you guys so much for joining me for this panel. It was really nice to meet both of you. And
Likewise.
you know, we can come over to the Discord. This what room are we in? We're in
Olentangy
Olentangy.
even.
Yeah.